These are the supplies I will be using in today's painting. Today, we are going to be painting a bleeding heart floral, which is such a unique blossom. I thought it would be a lot of fun. If you don't have Arches paper, you can use other brands like Fabriano, just whatever you enjoy working on. Just make sure it's 100% cotton so it's a pleasant experience. These are the materials I often use. Today, I will be using a little bit of drawing gum and some Dawn dish soap. So let's go ahead and get started. These are the paint colors that I will be using for the Bleeding Heart floral. I honestly probably could have used less, so feel free to just use the colors you have on hand and mix on the fly if you're confident with your color mixing. For those of you that are still a little skeptical and still practicing, no problem. Just pause the video, go to the video description, and I have listed out each of these colors for your reference. Permanent rose, alizarin crimson, sap green, ultramarine blue, Payne's gray, yellow ochre, and cadmium yellow. Let's get started. For those of you that don't know me, my name's Christy Arzola, and I release a YouTube video every Tuesday at 11 a.m. Denver time. It's just my way of sharing my knowledge, and I hope you get a lot of joy out of this. I deliberately film these videos in real time so you don't feel rushed, but feel free to pause the video at any point. And I intentionally do not add any kind of background music, so you have the choice to kind of create your own creative environment and play the music that brings you most inspiration. So today with this bleeding heart, I have provided or created a line drawing that you may use. So if you go in the video description below, you can download the line drawing as well as the reference photo for free. Once you've downloaded it, I want you to print it out at the dimension you plan on painting it. You can apply graphite to the back of your line drawing, tape it in position on top of your watercolor paper, and simply trace with the ballpoint pen. With just the pressure of your ballpoint pen, it is going to push the graphite onto your watercolor paper, giving you the perfect line drawing to follow for today's painting. I've obviously done this ahead of time. Feel free to pause the video while you complete this step. Once you have your line drawing onto your watercolor paper, we want to be mindful of any real dark pencil lines in areas where we have whites. So down in the bottom of the blossom here and right at the top where we have real soft pinks, these are areas that I want to make sure are lighter. So I'm using a kneaded eraser and I'm just tapping it on the dark pencil lines to lighten them up a bit before I begin painting. Now, I like to work in standard frame dimensions just in case I decide I like it or want to gift it. So I've applied just artist painter's tape around the edges. So I would like to begin with painting a blurred background behind this floral, but I'm a little fearful that it might get into the flower itself or the blossom itself. So I'm going to be using this drawing gum, otherwise known as masking fluid, to mask the outside areas of my blossom. But in order to protect my brush, I have put a small amount of Dawn dish soap in a cup of water, and I'm coating my brush with this soapy water to protect my tools. This will help prevent the masking fluid from damaging my brush. I can then now get my masking fluid on my brush, and my goal is really just to go around the outside edge so I can paint a blurred background without fear of it coming in contact with this blossom. Now I only go a short distance before I have to re-rinse in my soapy water before I dip into the masking fluid again. Anytime I apply masking fluid, I try to kind of trace the outside edge in one smooth brush stroke. It's not easy, but it just helps ensure that I don't get this weird lumpy edge. So I really take my time with my masking fluid. So I've only got a short distance, but once again, I have to re-rinse my brush in order to protect my tools from getting ruined. It's a love-hate relationship with this stuff. I'm going to get more masking fluid on my brush. Just making sure I have good coverage on all the edges of the blossom. I'm not worried about the stem because that's going to be a much darker color in the end. But I'm just going to rinse the masking fluid out of my brush using that soapy water. And then I'm going to go a step further and rinse that soapy water out of my brush using just my regular water. So while this masking fluid is drying, I'm going to mix up some soft colors to use in the background. I just want to imply leaves without having to necessarily paint them. So I'm getting some water on my palette. One of the colors I'm going to be making is kind of a lime green. So I'm starting off with some sap green in my water, but I want to add some yellow to it so it is not as dark. So I'm just adding some lemon yellow. I also want to make a little bit more of a lighter olive green color. So I'm using my sap green and I'm going to add the tiniest bit of permanent rose to that sap green so it turns more of an olive color. I don't need a lot of pigment in any of these mixtures because they are going to be in the background, so they don't have to be very dark. And then lastly, I'm going to add another green, just a small amount of sap green, but I'm going to add a little bit of yellow ochre to it. So it's a little bit more of kind of this golden green color. Okay, so I need to let this masking fluid dry and then we can apply clean water and paint a blurred background. Now that the masking fluid is dry, I'm going to apply clean water to the background. This does not have to be a real heavy application, just enough so that when I introduce some color, the edges will blur. I don't mind putting the water right over top of the stem because, again, that stem color is going to be so dark, it's going to cover up any of these soft green values I put down. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. Now, before I introduce any color, I take a moment to pause and look at my paper from a side glance, using the lights in my studio to see if I have in fact covered all of the background areas. I should have a very thin amount of water over the entire background, but no puddles. And there should be just a slight shine to the paper. Nothing too intense though. So now my goal is to paint some blurred leaves in the background. So I want to just kind of mimic the shape of leaves and stems, and I'm just switching off between the different greens that I might have. Notice how I change the angle of my brush to kind of give a hint of a leaf-like texture. Now, I'm not worried about perfecting the edges, cleaning them up, making them perfect, because this is supposed to be a blurred background. So I'm not worried about it. Once I notice that parts of the background are beginning to lose that shine and have more of a matte finish, that means things are beginning to dry and I need to get out. So this is the last opportunity I have to clean anything up. If I want, I can rinse my brush and dry it on a paper towel or sponge. And with a clean, nearly dry brush, I can come in and press with firm pressure to pick up some of the color out of areas to try and give a little bit more definition. But again, if it's a blurred background, it doesn't have to be perfect. So really be mindful of what you're doing. Try not to overwork it and get out before things begin to dry. That's the hard part, is knowing when to resist and get out. I'm just trying to create a little bit more interesting white negative space between my blurred leaves, since I have just a little bit of dampness still on my paper. And I think that's about all I can do. So I'm going to hit this with the blow dryer and proceed with the next layer. Now that everything is completely dry, I can make the choice of adding in one focal leaf that is a little bit more in focus. So I'm going to grab the darker olive green. I'm just using my large number 10 brush, and I'm going to come in and create just the end of the leaf first, And I want to kind of determine the size of the leaf. So I don't want it to quite go all the way off the page. So I'm just starting with a really slender kind of almond shape. And then from here, I'm going to use this number 10 to add some texture to the outer edge. And every time I come out, I'm going to try to go just a little wider with my leaf texture. And I want to bring that leaf to a little bit more of a narrow base and just off the edge of the painting. I'm just trying to make maybe the foreground texture a little larger to give a better perspective. And if I want, I can add a second smaller leaf. Okay. Now I'm going to let those leaves dry and then I can remove the masking fluid to begin the blossom. To remove the masking fluid, just make sure your fingers are clean and press down with firm pressure using your fingers. And the masking fluid is going to pill right up off the paper. Now, unfortunately, masking fluid will lift some of your pencil lines, so you may have to resketch some parts of your blossom if you feel it's necessary. If you have some areas where the masking fluid is being stubborn and doesn't want to lift, you can use a tool that's called a rubber cement pickup. You can have these for years. They turn all sorts of colors. So this one you can tell is well loved. But a rubber cement pickup just allows you to go over the area of the masking fluid and really ensure that it's all up. Because sometimes, depending on the age of your masking fluid or how long it was on your paper, it may be a little bit more challenging to peel. But I much rather make sure it's completely up and not encounter that I missed some when I bring in my color. So right now, just for the sake of the tutorial, I'm going to take a moment to kind of create more lines so you can see where my blossom is so we don't get lost. I'm just trying to have really gentle pressure so my lines aren't super dark, but I have my kneaded eraser nearby if I need to lift them and soften them a bit. Okay, so here's the blossom. It's back. I'm going to use my number 10 round and mix up some colors for the petals. So the first color I'm going to mix up is just going to be a really watered down, muted permanent rose. If I need to, I can have a scrap piece of paper to test my color just to make sure the value is very, very soft and faint. The next color I'm going to mix up is going to be more vibrant. It's still going to be the permanent rose, but I'm going to use less water and more pigment, so it's a darker. Third color I'm going to mix up will be the permanent rose, a very vibrant color, but I will be adding in a little bit of a cadmium red to darken it up. And a smidge of ultramarine blue. I need a nice dark color for some of the shadows on the blossom. So I feel like that's a good color. Now for the shadows that are in the white central area of the blossom, I just want a really soft, muted kind of gray purple. So I'm going to water down a little bit of Payne's gray, and I'm going to add a little bit of that permanent rose to try and create a gray purple color for the shadows. And that feels good. I might need to go a little darker, so I'm going to add a little bit more Payne's gray to it. And now I need a little bit more pink, so it's less of straight gray, and that feels better. All right, these colors are great to start off with. So before I begin that upper portion of the blossom, so the top portion, I just really want to lighten those pencil lines. I don't want them to be showing up in my finished piece. That's just my preference. And then the lines right in the center up against that light gray. I just rather be safe than sorry. So I'm going to use clean water, and I'm going to apply it just in the area where I see the pinks in this blossom. So I'm trying to keep the water off the background, out of the stem. If it hits the stem, it's really no biggie. I'm trying to stay away from that central white area. Now, any areas you apply water to that are very narrow or small as far as their surface area, they will dry significantly faster than the other areas. So just be aware of that and expect to have to apply a second layer of water if you wish for it to actually stay damp long enough for you to get your colors in. Now notice how I'm not bringing the color up into the very ends that curve up. I'm just letting that kind of be a little bit of water there, but I'm not filling that space in. I don't plan on painting that with color just yet. So I'm going to grab the watered down permanent rose just to get a nice base color over the entire blossom. I'm going to do this on both sides so I have an even result. If your color feels too dark, just add more water. You can even introduce more water right onto your paint. Now, for the sake of the tutorial, I'm avoiding rotating my painting just so I don't cause confusion on your end. However, if I were painting on my own, I would be rotating this painting frequently just so I am working at comfortable angles and not having to bend my wrist in weird ways to reach certain areas. So take control of your painting. Don't feel like it has to stay stationary. You'd be surprised how much more comfortable it is when you start rotating everything to fit what your preference is. All right, so I'm making a point to go around the outer edge of my blossom in one clean stroke, just so I have a nice, neat end product. Now, while things are still damp, I'm switching to my number 1 round, or looks like a number 2 round, dipping into the dark permanent rose color. And I dragged my brush across the rim of my palette to remove the excess, but I'm going to start in the center here. And I'm trying to create some textured lines, but I have to be very gentle with my pressure. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So it just kind of takes multiple attempts. But notice how I'm trying to drag my brush through in one stroke. I'm not doing, the little sketchy lines that sometimes we're tempted to do. I'm very much trying to identify the curve of the line that I want and doing it in one stroke as much as possible. When I get more towards the center of the blossom, I want to highlight near the stem, so I'm starting my line a little bit more distant from the center there. I'm going to try and recreate this texture on the opposite side. And I need to kind of hurry up because the paper is not going to wait for me to dry. The left side of my paper is already beginning to dry. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. Wherever you pick up your brush or end your line, your paintbrush, especially a round paintbrush, is going to kind of leave a little blob or release of paint. So be mindful where you lift up. You typically want to lift up in an area of shadow where that little excess addition of paint will actually help your painting. I'm going to go to my darker pink with the added red and blue. I don't know how I did this down here, but I'll show you how to clean that up. Accidents happen. So as long as your paper is still damp, you've got a little bit of working time. to get in additional shadow colors. Just be very mindful of your paper's condition. Sometimes you just have to wait for a second layer. All right, I feel like I'm running out of working time. I need to stop fiddling and just kind of get out. So I'm going to leave this alone. And while that's drying, I'm going to mix up a color for the stems. So right now, I do have some leftover green. If you're familiar with your color mixing, you might already know that adding any type of red to green will get you to a variation of brown. So rather than letting this green paint go to waste, I went ahead and just added some pink to it to create a brown, and this is something I can use for the stem. Now, if I want a dark stem color, I got to add quite a bit of pigment from both. So between red and green or pink and green, I'm just kind of taking my time to mix the colors until I get a brown that I like. And I think that brown will work. Now, I won't be using this brown on the stem that is currently connected with the blossom, but I can paint the stems that are just overlapping some of the background. So I'm using my number 2 round. Just painting wet on dry, trying to keep my stem even in width as much as possible. If there's little wobbles, I'm just going to embrace it. I can take some of this brown and add to my second green. And I can give the illusion of another stem that is a little bit more in the distance. Now, in order to get a thin stem, you just want to press down on your brush less. So have a lighter touch, hold your brush more vertical so your handle is pointed to the ceiling, and try to just touch the very end of your brush to your paper. While these areas are drying, I'm going to take a look at these foreground leaves and see if there's anything I can add to kind of give them just a little bit more. So I'm going to get some sap green with that brown, so it's a little bit more of an olive tone. But I want to make sure it's not too dark and more watered down. And I can just create a little bit of veining through the leaf. And notice how I don't go all the way to the very end of the leaf when I started that. And be mindful of the little water droplets. They love to just introduce themselves to your painting at the most unexpected times. And I'm not going to do that to both leaves. I think Just one is fine, and then maybe just a simple central vein in the rear leaf. And I can just deliberately keep that lighter since it's more of a background element. Okay, so this blossom here is a tiny bit damp yet, so I'm going to hit that with a blow dryer, and I'm going to show you how I handled cleaning up things like this. Now I'm going to apply clean water to the central part of the blossom. I made sure that this area where I erased is completely lifted and dry. That way, when I introduce water, it doesn't just completely make a mess. I don't need to go too far with the water or too wide. I'm going to get that purple gray water mixture, and I'm going to go to the very top of my shape. I'm going to do my best to get right up against the edge of the pink. In order to see this better, I have to kind of rotate my painting a little bit. Now, right at the very top, that shadow gets quite dark. So if I need to, I can bring in a little bit more Payne's gray just to darken that up so we have better contrast. So I'm trying to create that narrow gap in the blossom. And since watercolors dry to be about 20% lighter, I'm making a point to bring some of that darker color down just a little bit. If any of that water or shadow color is creeping into your blossom, use a clean paper towel to dab with firm pressure, and you can kind of pick that up or stop that movement. And I'm just using a clean, dry brush right now to kind of push and pull these grays around to kind of determine where they go. I can't really continue any additional detail on the center portion of the blossom until that area dries. So I need to give that space and return to the pink area. So I'm going to use that darker pink, red, and blue mixture. And I'm painting wet on dry. Now, notice how thick I went with the paint. I kind of allowed a little bit of puddling there. That was to ensure that the paint doesn't dry too quickly. Because what I'm going to do now is I'm going to bring some of these darks just around this curved corner, and then I'm going to rinse my brush and dry it. I'm going to soak up the excess puddling of red to thin it out because I don't want it to move too much. Once I've thinned that out, I'm now going to return with clean water. This is not a wet brush. I dabbed my sponge or paper towel first, so this is just damp, but it's not dripping. That's an important factor. So I'm going to come to the top of where this dark red stopped, and I'm going to add a little bit of water with gentle pressure. I'm staying away from the center because that's wet. I don't want those two to mix. And I'm going to use this water to kind of blend that edge. Once I'm happy with it, I'm going to leave it alone. And I'm going to go to the opposite side to do the same thing. So I'm coming in with that dark red. Remember, I went in initially pretty heavy-handed, allowing some puddling of the paint so it doesn't dry too quickly. I'm going to bring this color down and around the curve. Once I'm down and around the curve, I'm going to rinse my brush and dry it off on a sponge or paper towel. With my dry brush, I'm going to dab that puddle of paint to soak up the excess. This will minimize how far the paint wants to travel when I do the edge softening. So thinning it out is going to help make sure that it doesn't go too far. I'm going to rinse my brush again, lightly tap my sponge so it's damp but not wet. And I'm going to go to the top edge of where that red ended, and I'm going to blend it in with the rest of the blossom towards the top. Keeping in mind that the center here is still a little damp, so I want to stay clear of that area. So I just re-rinse my brush and tap my sponge if I feel like there's still a top edge visible, and I blend that. And that takes practice, so give yourself patience if you haven't done that technique before. Now at the very top, things are now dry, so I can paint the stem at the top. I'm going to use that same brown that I made up with the green and red. Painting wet on dry. If you would prefer to switch to a smaller number 1 or number 2 brush, you can. It's just up to you. But this is a narrow little stem, so I'm trying to be mindful of my pressure, keeping my brush vertical and not pressing down too hard, and that's going to help me get a more narrow line. I can soften the edge where the browns meet with each other if I need to. Then I'm going to give that space to dry. So while these areas are drying, I'm going to go ahead and mix up some additional color for the bottom of this blossom. I need a little bit of a yellow, a little bit more of a gold, and a little more purple. So if I don't have any space left on my palette, I use a sponge and I literally just wipe the paint out of the well. I let the sponge kind of soak it up and I clear out some room. It works really well. So with mixing the new colors, I'm switching back to my large number 10 round. And the first color I want to mix up is some of that lemon yellow. I want it to be pretty vibrant. I want it to stand out. I'm going to add a little cadmium yellow to it so it doesn't look too neon. I can then go right next to it, add some water, and I'm now going to have some cadmium, but I'm going to mix the cadmium with a purple. So I'm going to use the Purple Lake, and mixing those colors together should get me a nice golden yellow. If it's not too dark, then I need to add more pigment. So cadmium yellow and Purple Lake will get you that golden color, which is a really nice yellow for in the shadows. I'm going to rinse my brush, add some clean water to a new area of my palette. And this time I want just more of a purple. I'm going to add a very small amount of yellow to it so I can make that purple a little bit more natural and not so vibrant. So using complementaries with each other really can help. And I like that color. That works well. Okay, so for this, I'm going to make sure things are dry, which they are not. So I need to hit it with a blow dryer before proceeding to the next step. Now that things are dry, I'm going to use my small #2 round to add some of the details at the bottom of the blossom. Now, there is some bright whites right through the center that I want to be mindful of, and I don't want to cover them up. So I'm going to start with my yellows, kind of hugging that pencil line that was in our line drawing. Now, right in the center, this yellow gets wide and then narrows back out. And it doesn't go all the way down. It just kind of stops partial way, okay? So now that I've created that shape with my lemon yellow, cadmium yellow mix, I now need to use that golden yellow on the opposite side and try and mirror that same shape. So I'm kind of following that pencil line that was in the line drawing. Right in the center, I want to kind of flare that shape out and come back in and fill that in with gold right now. Now towards the bottom, that's where we have some of that purple. So I am going to pull some of this purple aside and water it down quite a bit so it's barely visible. I'm going to return to the left edge because that edge is probably really close to already being dry. And I'm going to put this watered down purple right in this edge. I want it to extend all the way to the outside edge. I just want it to be watered down enough so that it's not too dark. So add more water if you need to. Once you have that area filled, before it dries, get that darker purple and tap it in through the center to give a little bit more color. I'm going to do the same thing on the opposite side. So I'm using that really watered down purple to kind of start the shape. Making sure it is nice and light. I don't want it to be too dark. So if I have to add more water, I add more water, even to the surface of the paper if I need to. Once I have that area filled in before it dries, I grab some of that dark purple and just tap my brush through the center. Now I'm going to continue working with that darker purple to create some values towards the top. So towards the top where we have that yellow shape kind of curving, we want to bring in some of that purple right in next to it. And then I'm just going to use a little bit of water to kind of drag that color down to a narrow point alongside the yellow. The tough part is it's trying to be symmetrical when nature requires it. So I'm going to the right now with that dark purple, bringing that color down to about halfway. I'm going to rinse my brush, have just a damp brush with clean water, and I'm going to blend that down into a point. So we're starting to get that definition now in the center. Now, towards the top here, we have a white crease that goes through the center. So in order to make that look like a highlight, I need to darken up the sides. So I'm going to return to that gray purple mixture that we used in the beginning. And I want to begin by identifying the center line. So I'm using a very gentle touch to get a nice narrow line that runs through the center. And then I'm going to darken up that color towards the top. Once I start getting closer to the bottom, I rinse my brush, dab my sponge so it's damp and not wet. So I'm removing that excess water. And then before it dries, I come in with the damp brush and I just kind of blend the bottom edge of that color. But I want to try and maintain some whites there. I don't want to bring that color down too far. I'm now going to get that gray purple and do the same thing on the opposite side. So I'm going to try and create a vertical line, but I want to maintain a thin white area that is untouched by paint through the center. Not easy. Take some brush control, but if you end up accidentally covering it up, try not to fret. If you have white gouache, it's a great way to kind of bring back those whites using a final touch. So try not to be too hard on yourself. Everything takes practice. So I'm getting some color in. I don't bring it all the way down. I stop before the end. I rinse the color out of my brush and drag my brush across the sponge. And I just gently soften that bottom edge. I re-rinse, and with clean water, I continue to soften, trying to avoid bringing that color all the way to the bottom. So we're just kind of giving some definition there, but it's starting to pop more, which is exactly what we need. So I'm going to continue using this gray purple to continue creating some shapes down at the bottom. So this white edge does continue all the way down through the center. So I want to kind of imagine that it continues. So I need to draw that center line again, being very gentle and light-handed. Painting this at a larger scale might make some of these shapes easier. So don't feel like just because I'm painting it on a small scale, you need to as well. Choose to go larger if it simplifies your life. So I just kind of painted the right side, but notice how I didn't bring the color all the way to the right edge. I'm leaving some of that little sliver of white showing through. So now the hard part is recreating what I just did on the opposite side. Having less paint on your brush will make it easier to get narrow, thin paint strokes. If you have too much paint on your brush is going to want to always leave wide marks. So just be mindful of how much you've loaded your brush. All right. So while these areas are drying, it won't take long. I'm going to add additional definition and shadow to the blossom, okay? So we have light primarily coming from the left side, but I do need to darken up the color on the right side of my blossom. So with that in mind, I am going to apply a thin layer of clean water using a gentle touch. I'm not pressing hard because I don't want to gouge or lift the previous layers that are already there. Once I have clean water there, I'm going to get that more vibrant pink, not the one with the added red. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. And I'm just using a mostly dry brush to kind of push this color right up to the edge of the blossom, and I'm doing my best to kind of maintain clean edges. If I see the color starting to creep up into the area where I want the highlight of my blossom, I rinse and dry my brush off, and I just use firm pressure to kind of pull some of that paint color out of the area where I want the highlight. But I need to kind of get out before things begin to dry. So while this vibrant pink is still wet, I am going to try and reestablish a darker shadow down towards the bottom. So I'm using that dark pink and red mixture with the added blue just to give a bit of shadow where this all curves. Sometimes tapping a brush helps it release the color and pigment, so sometimes I find that's beneficial. If I need to, I can use this darker color to reestablish some of the texture that is in the blossom. I just don't want to go too high with it. So while that side is drying, I can then bring my attention over to the left side where I do need to push some of my values a bit more. So I'm going to add clean water using gentle pressure so I don't gouge the layers. It helps to have a quality soft brush. If you're working with a cheap brush, the bristles potentially could be very rough, which causes layers to lift more easily. So, a brush with softer bristles will actually help you glaze and layer color without lifting more easily. All right, so now that I have the water in, I'm switching to my number 2 round because I only need a small amount of darks on this side. And I'm keeping the darks more in the center. If I need to, I can add some of these darks just to some of the petal texture if I feel it's necessary. But I don't want to darken everything up on this side because this side is where the light source is. Once I'm happy with it, I just make sure my edges are nice and clean before I kind of step away and let this dry. Okay, so I feel better about that value change. I'm going to let that dry, and I'm now going to bring back my attention to the bottom. Okay. Now, there are some areas in the folds down at the bottom that should be a little more subtle. So, for example, the outside edge of this central purple area here should be softer. It should gradually go to white. So I can take just my number 2 round with clean water and I can kind of scrub the edge of that purple to soften it so it's not such a defined hard edge. That way it looks more like a gradient. And I can do the same thing on the opposite side. I can just use a clean number 2 round, letting the water do the work, and I'm just dragging the bristles of my brush over that outside edge of the purple shape. So I soften it and it looks more like a gradient as it meets up with the whites. Now, towards the bottom here, we do want to kind of push our values of the purples. We want them to be a little darker for better contrast. So I'm bringing that dark purple right up against that white edge. If I need to tap my brush so it releases a little bit more color to darken it, I can. But then I'm going to do a little bit of edge softening at the top. So I rinse my brush, dab a paper towel or sponge with it to remove the excess water. And then when I have just a barely damp brush, I use it to blend the top edge. And I'm going to repeat the process on the left side. So bringing in that dark purple. I'm going to rinse my brush, tap my sponge to remove the excess water. I'm going to go up to the top edge, drag the color up just to soften it. All right. So some of the last steps that I need to do are related to additional textures and shadows on this upper blossom. So where this heart shape comes in towards the stem, it creates a shadow where the blossom meets the stem in here. So I need to do a little bit more values in there. So I'm going to come in. I want to imagine, I don't know how I keep dropping water everywhere, but I want to imagine that I want to come up from the edge of the stem, and just on the inside here, I want to get a little bit more of a darker color. And it's always about that edge softening. Damp brush, I just kind of smear that outside edge so it looks a little bit more natural. But now it looks like we have a shadow in there, which is exactly what we want. So I'm going to do the same thing on the opposite side. I want to kind of imagine that coming up from the stem. I kind of create this curve to indicate where that shadow goes. And then I bring that color up. And I'm going to use a brush with barely any water just to kind of help soften some of the edges so it doesn't look as harsh. Edge softening takes practice. If you have too much water on your brush, the water is going to kick back into your color and remove it. If you don't have enough water, you won't be able to soften it. So it does take practice. So now I'm going to use that really, really watered down permanent rose from the very beginning layers of the blossom. And I'm just going to paint wet on dry any kind of petal texture that I think might be beneficial. So I'm just doing light line work. I find that a lighter color in the beginning is kind of important so you don't overdo it. I much rather have a subtle texture than a texture that's too dark. I can always come in and add layers on top later to darken it up, but if we go too dark from the beginning, it's really hard to come back from. So I'm just trying to follow the contour of the blossom, creating that line work. I'm going to do the same thing on the opposite side. So really watered down, permanent rose, light touch, following the contour. Your lines don't even have to extend from bottom to top. It's just about hinting to the texture. You don't have to do it everywhere. I'm definitely better on the right side than I am the left. I'm going to use some of that dark red-pink mixture and just give a little bit more definition on the underside of this blossom so it looks like a fold. I'm going to do the same thing on the opposite side. I just want to create a real narrow dark so it kind of reads like a fold. I keep wobbling though, so it keeps getting wider. I can also use this dark red to go down through the center of the blossom to push those darks. When I meet up with those grays, I can do more edge softening if I need to blend. I'm going to grab more of that brown. I'm going to add some additional layers to the branches. I think I just want to create a little bit more texture. So I'm just doing some curved lines so it doesn't read as flat. Adding a little bit more of the olive green to the rear branch because it feels like it was blending into the background a little too much. And then lastly, for any final touches, if you want, you can use white gouache. So it's really kind of handy for any bright white highlights. So I can sometimes just take my cleans brush into the end of the white gouache, and this will help me just add a little bit more white highlights in a select few places so I can get more of that dimension. But if you don't water it down enough, it will kind of skip the texture of your watercolor paper. So you want to make sure to water it down. So just add the highlights where you see them. We've got some highlights that are down along the very bottom of the blossom. I'm just going to make sure that center point is nice and bright to pull it forward. Sometimes it takes a couple layers of white in order for it to really stand out on the finished painting. At the very top, I want the stem to look like it's kind of going through a little hole in the branch. So I just taken a brush to kind of lighten the front portion so it looks like the branch is coming through that little hole. And I'm going to darken up the very base of this stem for better contrast, as well as the right edge. If I need to do some edge softening to blend it, I can. I also want to darken up the stem in the back here for more contrast as well. So I'm just doing a second layer on the underside of the branch. But there you have it. If you like this tutorial, give me a thumbs up, leave a comment. It means a lot to me and keeps me motivated. And just continue to practice and enjoy painting. It's supposed to be peaceful. Don't be too hard on yourself. Just enjoy the process. Have a fantastic day.